the page that you have before you is a copy of a manuscript in Madrid, in Spain. It is probably a 17th century manuscript, but the tradition that it preserves is in fact older than this manuscript, and it actually appeared in print in Hebrew literature based on another manuscript in a 16th century work called the Me'ore Naim by Azaria de Rossi of Italy. In any event, this is a very interesting passage, and I'd like to read it together with you as an introduction to the Aleppo Codex controversy. If you start from the second line at the top, two words from the end of the line, we can pick it up. Mitzrayim yesh harbei alafim Yehudim. There are thousands of Jews in Egypt. The book from which this excerpt is taken, it is a handwritten manuscript that has not appeared in print, is a travelogue. A Jew who traveled throughout the world, recorded what it is that he discovered wherever he went. We don't know who wrote this book. We don't know when it was written. We do have this manuscript from approximately the 17th century. It might even be older than that. In any event, all we have is an anonymous book called Tzurat Haaretz. The manuscript at the beginning says the title of this work is Tzurat Haaretz, but otherwise scholarship knows nothing about this. Anyway, he gets to Egypt and he says that there are thousands of Jews in Egypt. This is obviously in the medieval period. V'yesh lahem Sefer Torah shekatav Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimoni. And in Egypt there's a copy of the Torah, indeed, a Sefer Torah, written by none other than Rambam. Moshe hu katav b'chumash kadmon. Katuv miyado. There's a Sefer Torah written by Moshe ben Maimon in his own hand, and it follows or agrees with some ancient text. Ve'elu dvarav sham. And in this manuscript, Sefer Torah, or manuscript of the Torah, there's an inscription by the Rambam which reads, Ani Moshe ben Maimon, kamo kineti Lashem Elokei Yisrael, I became zealous for the Lord, biroti Sefer Torah b'Mitzrayim, sheparshiotehem, pituchotehem, ustumotehem, usdurotehem, asher lo, and clearly this should be amended to kadat. It's described, didn't write the right word here, asher lo kadat. That is, Rambam became zealous for the Lord. He said that he saw a Sefer Torah in Egypt that the Sifrei Torah in Egypt, their parshiyot, and now we have a list of technical terms for different kinds of paragraphing in the Torah. As all of you know, in our Sifrei Torah today, I'm stopping now as an aside, Sifrei Torah are arranged by paragraphs. We generally refer to them as closed paragraphs and open paragraphs. Closed paragraphs are called ptuchot. What that means is that paragraph 1 ends at the beginning of a line. We then have at least the space of 9 letters, and the second paragraph begins on the same line. That's what we usually mean by stumot. Closed paragraph. Open paragraphs, paragraph 1 ends on a certain line. Paragraph 2 begins either on the next line or several lines later, as the case may be. In other words, a total blank space between two parts of a column, but that's what we refer to as ptuchot. As a matter of fact, there are other kinds of divisions, and there are in Sifrei Torah today, other kinds of divisions. They have technical terms, and you're seeing some of those technical terms in the text in front of you. Namely, Sdurotehem refers to Parsha Sdura, which is a different kind of Parsha, which some Sifrei Torah today have and some don't have. Very briefly, one major definition of Sdura that occurs in some texts is one paragraph ends, let's say, the third word into a line, and the next paragraph begins immediately under that last letter. The next line, under that last letter, the first letter of the next paragraph begins, rather than from the beginning of the line. That's what's meant by Sdura, according to many of the Rishonim. Anyway, that's what's being referred to here. So the Rambam said he examined Sifrei Torah in Egypt, and he saw that they were shelo kadat. They were improper. The manuscripts disagreed among themselves. And there's a further aside, I'll tell you immediately, that just as the halacha is that a Sefer Torah must be written perfectly, and it can have not an extra letter, and it can't have a letter missing, if it's yater or if it's chaser, in either case, the Sefer Torah is pasul. And in our synagogues, we close Sefer Torah. If you happen to get an aliyah and your Bal Koreh is reading the Torah and a letter is missing or a letter is added, we close it. It is a Sefer Torah pasul. So here too, the halacha applies to parshiyot, tuchot, stumot, and so on. That is, the paragraphing in a Sefer Torah has to follow halacha. If you have an open paragraph where halacha says it should be closed, or a closed paragraph where halacha says it should be open, your Sefer Torah is pasul. So the Rambam was very troubled. He examined Sefer Torah in Egypt, in his day, in the 12th century apparently, and he saw that there was irbuvya, that the parshiyot were not proper. V'darashti al atzmi eit lasot l'Hashem. So Rambam cited the verse in Tehillim that there comes a time, eit lasot l'Hashem heferu toratecha. There's a time where the proper way to observe Torah is to, as it were, violate Torah. Namely, Rambam should be sitting and studying Torah all the time. So he decided that in order to preserve Torah, instead of studying Torah, he had to be mevatel, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. He had to stop studying Torah and go look for a good manuscript of the Torah. Ubitalti milimu dai, I gave up my lessons and my learning, my studying. Lichtov sefer Torah, Torat Elokeinu, chamisha chumashim kshurim yachad, b'kuntrusim, kedei lagia ulatik mehem shar sfarim. I decided to drop everything I was doing and prepare a master copy of the Torah. A master copy of the Torah from which everybody now will be able to copy Sefer Torah properly. And it would have the right spelling, and it would have tuchot, stumot, and so on. Now, in order to do this, the Rambam had to copy from some authoritative text. What did the Rambam copy from? The Mitzrayim is the famous book in Egypt. It is, I copied from a whole Bible, a whole Hebrew Tanakh. Shaya Yerushalayim, Nemot HaTanaim, and this should read obviously V'Hamoraim. That is, I found a copy of all of Tanakh that was in Yerushalayim from the time of the Tanaim and the Amoraim. Ukishenukeda Yerushalayim al Yedei, and it looks like Karlon. And when Jerusalem was captured by some king, Lukach Misham, this scroll of 24 books was taken from Yerushalayim, HaSefer, Ubashevi, and it was taken captive, as it were, to Egypt. Beretz Mitzrayim v'alav anu somchin. And that is the scroll that I used in order to write a Sefer Torah. Beit gamarti sifri kiyad Elohai atova alai. And when I completed writing this manuscript, this official manual, Nasa alai nasa libi oti lalechet mitzrayim l'malchut Burgonya. And when I finished writing this scroll, Nasa libi oti lalechet mitzrayim l'malchut Burgonya, I made the decision to travel from Egypt to Burgundy, to France, Asher b'Tzarfat, u'medinat Yilon, hayoshevet al nahar, and this is the So'en, not the Cien, but So'ana, not the Sen, not the Sen. Bo darashti v'chakarti v'sha'alti heitev b'asher nimtza sham Sefer Torat Eloheinu michtav yad kodesh Ezra HaKohen HaGadol Sofer Mahir. Rambam did research. He discovered that there was a copy of a Sefer Torah written by none other than Ezra himself. And
he went to France?
That's what it says.
Do you think this is a problem?
Well, we'll talk about it. Let's see. All right. And we found a Sefer of Ezra Kohen HaGadol Sofer Mahir Ve'iveti imi tikun sofrim tuchot stumot sturot she'takti miSefer 24 asher huva Yerushalayim. I brought with me my manual that I wrote based upon this certain text that was in Yerushalayim. Umatzati b'gvil, and I found on the parchment that he had now in France, Kol ptuchot ustumot mekuvanot yachad im hasefer asher heveti imi. The Rambam compared his text with the text in Burgundy, and all the ptuchot and stumot were the same. Mekuvanot yachad im hasefer asher heveti imi v'samachti ad mo'od. I was delighted. Kibalti alai lasot yom mishteh v'simcha. That day that he made this comparison, he now knew that he had a correct text of the Torah. became a day of celebration, which he would celebrate annually. לעשות יום משתה בשמחה באותו היום כל שנה ושנה הוא כ"ה לירח זיו. That was the 25th day of the month Iyar, called Ziv in the Tanakh. וטרחתי לכבוד צורי והעתקתי מן הספר ההוא, and once I was in France already, so I copied from that scroll כל תיבות חסרות ויתרות, תיבות גדולות וקטנות ומשונות ומופרכות, all other kinds of variant spellings and letters and so on, so that I had a complete perfect text. After all, this was the text of Ezra. You can't do better than that. כדי לעשות ספר תורת השם בלי חסור ויתור, to have a copy that's absolutely perfect in every way. ובשובי לאדמתי, when I returned to Egypt, כתבתי תורת אלוקינו כדת. And then, of course, there's a mitzvah taseh to write a Sefer Torah. So when the Rambam returned after this trip, he came back to Egypt and he wrote a Sefer Torah kasher. In other words, he now wrote a Sefer Torah without vowels and without any kind, not a chumash. He didn't write it on paper or on papyrus. Now he wrote it on cloth, a kosher Sefer Torah, based upon the research that he had done. B'shuvi la'admati. So he wrote a Torah kadat, and everybody copies from my Sefer Torah. Zachra li Hashem Elokai l'tova. This is a pasuk in Nehemiah. May God remember me, etc. For good, for doing this wonderful deed. U'lishalem maskurti la'olam haba ad kan varav. Until here is the inscription as it's written by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, lest you, as some of you already had some doubts about this, let me assure you that some great authorities saw this text, even though it's in manuscript. And none other than the Chida, who was one of the world's greatest experts in Hebrew books and manuscripts, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who lived in the second half of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century, one of the great Gedolim, the rabbi of Livorno, Italy, and previous to that, the Meshulach from the city of Hebron to the Jewish people wherever they were. The Chida in his book called Shem HaGdolim, under the entry of Ovadia Bar Tanora, the famous commentator on the Mishnah, cites this passage. Doesn't cite the whole text exactly as it's here, but it's very clear if you read the Chida that he had this in front of him. He gives a general summary of it, and then writes as follows. וכמה הלכתה גברתה, אנו לומדים מנועם שיח כסף נבחר לשון צדיק. It's a passage verse in Mishlei, and of course the Chida writes a beautiful Hebrew, he knows Tanakh by heart. So he says, look how beautiful this text is, and look how many things we learn from it. כי כל הלשון הם דברי הרמב"ם עצמו, אלא שאני שניתי קצת אגב שיתפה. Here he just gave a short summary of it, and he didn't follow exactly the language of the text that we have in front of us. זה יצא ראשונה, the first thing that we learn from this text is שכתב הרמב"ם עזרא הסופר מהיר הכהן הגדול. The text says here that we found a text by Ezra, and it doesn't just say Ezra, and the Chida misses nothing. It says here Ezra Kohen HaGadol. Does it say it here?
Yes.
Yes, it is, right there, in the middle, a little below the middle. Sefer Torat Elokeinu Michtav Yad Kodesh Ezra HaKohen HaGadol. Sofer Mahir. That's right. Uchach she'Ezra haya Kohen Gadol. He says, so from here you see that Ezra was a Kohen Gadol. You wouldn't know from reading Sefer Ezra or Nehemiah that Ezra was a Kohen Gadol. But here you see that he was a Kohen Gadol. וכן כתב בהקדמתו לחיבורו משנה תורה. Indeed, if you read the Hakdamat of the Mishneh Torah, and the Rambam lists in the Masoret how from Moshe Rabbeinu down the Torah was given from one generation to the next, and when he mentions Ezra in the chain of tradition, the Rambam says Ezra Kohen HaGadol. Quite amazing. It's not a simple matter at all. אמנם חז"ל אמרו דעזרא לא היה כהן גדול. In the Gemara, there are various places from where it is mashma that Ezra was not a Kohen Gadol. But the Rambam said he was a Kohen Gadol, and here we have a text indeed that says the same. וזאת שנית, בעניין הפרשיות פתוחות סתומות מלבד מה שכתב בחיבור והעתיק מספר תורה שכתב בן אשר, כך מצא בספר תורה שכתב עזרא הסופר מאנשי כנסת הגדולה. We will shortly read a famous passage in the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam, Hilchot Sefer Torah, where the Rambam writes that when he had to write a Sefer Torah, he followed a famous scroll that he found in Egypt. It was Sefer Ben Asher, which seems to be the first text that's referred to here. The Rambam says it was this famous scroll that he copied from. But we would not know from the Mishneh Torah that the Rambam used another scroll as well. Our text says that he also traveled to France and he found this Sefer Torah of Ezra. So Chida, of course, notices that immediately and says this is another chibush of our text. V'yod ba shlishiya, ki al pi zeh תנוח דעתנו בהרגשת הרב מרם דילונזנו בריש ספרו היקר אור תורה שמהה כבן אשר כאילו יצא בת קול בן אשר ובן נפתלי הלכה כבן אשר ולא כבן נפתלי. העין שם ולפי העמוד העדיפה מבת קול ורבי יהושע השיב לא בשמיים היא אבל בפועל נראה בעליל ספר הקודש מיד עזרא הסופר שהוא מכוון לדעת בן אשר. Those of you who know something about the history of the Masorah will know that there are two famous Masoretic schools that we know about. We know very little about them, but there are these two famous schools referred to in the text. One Masoretic school is known as the school of Ben Asher, and the other Masoretic school is known as the school of Ben Naphtali. And they disagree about how you write and read certain words in the Torah and in all of Tanakh. And we follow the school of Ben Asher. And many authorities through the generations were wondering why. Who said that if there's a dispute between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali, that halacha is like Ben Asher? That's what the Chida is addressing here. It was always a mystery. It's true the Rambam said in the Mishneh Torah that he followed the scroll of Ben Asher. And the question is why? Why did he follow the scroll of Ben Asher? In any event, the Chida says there's no question anymore. We now know that, yes, he initially followed the scroll of Ben Asher, and he used it for Ptuchot and Stumot, but what does it say? He then went to France and he found a text by none other than Ezra HaSofer, and they were the same. There were no differences. And the answer is, we have proof from the text of Ezra HaKohen that indeed Ben Asher's method is the correct method and the correct text. So, the Chida. He actually says more. He says one other Vet Rova, using Lashon of Chazal and Lashon of the Torah, and playing with it. And a fourth teaching that I learned from this text, מה שכתב שקיבל יום משתה ושמחה ביום ההוא לעשותו בכל שנה. The Rambam established a new holiday, a personal holiday. יש קצת סיוע לסברת מהרמ"ל אשכר בתשובות סימן מ"ט. דעיר שקיבלו לעשות פורים בנס שנעשה להם חייבים לעשותו. It's the whole question whether a Jew is allowed to establish new holidays, even if they're personal holidays. Are you allowed to make new festivals for yourself? And there was a debate in the Rishonim about this, and from this Rambam, who says that he established a holiday evermore in his family, apparently, on this day, we see that such holidays can, in fact, be established, so long as they are personal or part of the family and so on, and not declared to be universal Jewish holidays. Okay, all that in the Chida, in Sefer Shem Hagdolim. This text that you all have in front of you was published recently in a magazine called Kulmos, and I actually Xeroxed it from this magazine, a long article in this magazine. This is a magazine prepared for scribes and for all Jews in general who write Sifrei Torah. Anyone who would like to engage in writing a Sefer Torah or support the writing of a Sefer Torah, and it is called appropriately Kulmos, or the quill that's used in order to write a Sefer Torah, Michtav HaRambam, which is what I copied and you all have in front of you now in a long article detailing this. This is done fairly recently, and the reason it's presented here is precisely to show you, as it says again and again in the article, the Mesirat Nefesh of the Rambam. The Rambam, after all, was a busy man. Yet the Rambam wrote a Sefer Torah, which is quite amazing, and he did. That there's no question. And moreover, it says here that he indeed traveled as far as Europe in order to investigate another scroll, and when he did that, he found out that the scroll that he originally copied from was in fact correct. And if the Rambam engaged in this kind of activity and was Moshe Nafsho for a correct Sefer Torah, then every Jew today, so argues the editor of this magazine, has an obligation to see to it that his copy or her copy of the Torah is correct. And this is a campaign to have all Sifrei Torah examined by computers, by computer check to make sure, by computer, that there are no errors in the Sefer Torah, which is quite interesting, and that's what this organization that publishes Kumus is all about. You see, a Sefer Torah has to be distinguished from lettuce. What do I mean? Lettuce, according to almost all halachis that I know, yes, they have to be investigated for little insects, but there is a rule here, and the rule here is that I can use my eyes. And halachically, I'm supposed to use my eyes. If I can see the insects, then fine, I have to remove those insects. If I can't see the insects, then halakha doesn't require me to do anything beyond that. I don't have to stand with a magnifying glass over lettuce for lettuce to be kosher. What the eye sees is what determines what is and what isn't kosher. But a Sefer Torah is not lettuce. A Sefer Torah is either kasher or it's pasul. If we read in the Beit Knesset, we pull out a Sefer Torah, and in the middle of reading it, we thought it was a kasher, and now we look at it and we suddenly find a letter is missing. The answer is it's pasul. I have to close it, I have to bring out another Sefer Torah. It's just, I didn't know it was pasul, now I know it's pasul. But either it was kasher or it was pasul. It's one of those two possibilities, there's no in between. And in the case of a Sefer Torah, if indeed I examine it carefully, whether with a magnifying glass or better with a computer, and can determine beforehand that there are no errors in the Sefer Torah, why not? I'd like to know that my Sefer Torah is kasher. So that's what this is all about. Now our passage is not without serious problems. So I have with me one volume from the Mishneh Torah. Now listen carefully what the Rambam wrote in the Mishneh Torah, in Hilchot Sefer Torah, chapter 8, פרק ח' הלכה ד'. ולפי שראיתי שיבוש גדול בכל הספרים, since I examined all the manuscripts, all the books, apparently in Egypt, and they were all erroneous. ולפי שראיתי שיבוש גדול בכל הספרים שראיתי בדברים אלו, that is in matters of ptuchot and stumot. That's the context here. The previous paragraph in the Rambam is talking about paragraphing of the Torah. וכן בעלי המסורת שכותבים ומחברים להודיע הפתוחות והסתומות נחלקים בדברים אלו במחלוקת הספרים שסומכים עליהם. And even the Masoretes, even those manuscripts, not kosher Sifrei Torah, handwritten manuscripts written by Masoretic scholars, experts in Tanakh, where they have the divisions, the paragraphing called ptuchot and stumot, even these disagree amongst themselves. They don't agree. So what are you supposed to do if you're writing a Sefer Torah? Remember, if one parsha is that should be stuma ptucha, or vice versa, your Sefer Torah is pasul. וכן בעלי המסורת שכותבים ומחברים להודיע הפתוחות והסתומות נחלקים בדברים אלו ומחלוקת הספרים שסומכים עליהם, ראיתי לכתוב הנה כל פרשיות התורה הסתומות והפתוחות. So I have incorporated into the Mishneh Torah a complete list of all the parshiyot in the Torah, identifying which are ptuchot and which are stumot, and you'll be able to tell from me how to write a Sefer Torah. כדי לתקן עליהם כל הספרים ולהגיע מהם. וספר שסמכנו עליו בדברים אלו, and you'll ask me, and how did I know what to write? So what did I use as my authority? הוא הספר הידוע במצרים, I used the famous scroll in Egypt, שהוא כולל 24 ספרים. I used an entire Hebrew Bible, a sefer that had 24 books in it. שהיה בירושלים, used to be in Jerusalem, מכמה שנים, להגיע ממנו הספרים, it was used by others to copy correct scrolls, ועליו היו הכל סומכים. And everybody relied on this text. לפי שהגיעו Ben Asher, because this text was corrected by Ben Asher himself. ודקדק בו שנים הרבה, and many years Ben Asher kept correcting this text. והגיעו פעמים רבות, he corrected it many times, כמו שהעתיקו, as we have a Kabbalah. ועליו שמחתי בספר התורה שכתבתי כהלכתו. And I used his text for writing my own Sefer Torah. That's the passage in the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam. One other piece of evidence that needs to be adduced, and then we can begin to evaluate the various sources. I'm holding in my hand one volume from a book called Kiryat Sefer by Rabbi Menachem Meiri. Menachem Meiri was one of the great Rishonim in Provence, in southern France, and lived at the beginning of the 14th century, first quarter of the 14th century. And he too was worried about how to write a Sefer Torah, and he wrote 2 volumes, a very important work, a landmark work in the history of how he writes Sefer Torah to this day, and it is called Kiryat Sefer. Volume 1, page 45, the Meiri says, I have a tremendous problem. I don't know how to write Ptuchot and Stumot. I began examining Sifrei Torah, I began examining manuscripts, and no 2 are the same. I don't know what to do. He doesn't know how to define Ptucha and Stuma. He sees different kinds of arrangements in different Sifrei Torah. So he doesn't know what the Tzurot are, v'lo b'minyan parshiyot HaTorah, kama hem ha'ptuchot, kama hem ha'stumot, v'lo matzinu liyidiyat davar zeh b'birur shum biur maspik, lo b'talmud, lo b'Yerushalmi, lo b'Vraita, v'af ha'goynim lo re'imim somchim bazeh elo mipi sfarim yishamim v'yakim l'fi kabalatam. Ukvar yatzati bazeh l'minyan, im ksat gdolei hador. So Meiri says, I contacted the other gdolei hador, and we were going to go out l'minyan, meaning we were going to work together and establish a rule, take a head count, and decide once and for all how to write a Sefer Torah. Here in southern France, and with rabbis in northern France and rabbis in Germany, but we didn't know how to solve it. We couldn't do it. We had no way of knowing which of these manuscripts is correct. Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia of Toledo had already made such a list of Parshiot, and it had produced a Sefer based on such a list, and a copy of that was sent to the Meiri. He also said, Shetarach v'shalach b'chol ha'yeshivot u'be'eretz ha'ma'arav u'rabbanei Ashkenaz ma shematza b'chtei l'smoch alav katav Sefer Torah shelo. And how did Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia know how to do it? He also sent to Germany, notice, he sent to Eretz Marav, to Eretz Yisrael, everywhere, all over, wherever he could, Kol HaYeshivot, gathered together materials, and he wrote based on those manuscripts he felt he could trust best. So the Meiri, in a book published sometime between 1300 and 1313. Now let's go back to our text. Yes, go ahead.
The discrepancies are only to constitute not textual. Is that correct?
Where? I don't know what. Yes, in this passage in Meiri and in our passage here, they're only talking about, in the first half of this passage, Ptuchot and Stumot, nothing else. He does say later, when he saw that second text, Sefer Ezra, that the Sefer Ezra he examined for Chaserot Yiterot as well. Right? Several lines down. But the Rambam in Hilchot Sefer Torah and the Meiri in the passage that I read to you was only concerned, both of them were only concerned with Ptuchot and Stumot. Now there are some interesting things that need to be noticed. According to the text that we have here, what's said is that the Rambam found this text in Egypt that had 24 books in it, and it was before that in Yerushalayim. And what did the Rambam do with this text? The Rambam prepared a tikkun. That's what it says here. It says here that the Rambam had this text in front of him, and based on this text, he prepared a model text. A model text, not what? Not what? Well, a model text and not what? What is a model text? Not a Sefer Torah. Here it says all he did was prepare a model text. He then went to France, and when he saw the other manuscripts, and both manuscripts agreed, then he came back and he wrote a Sefer Torah. That's what it says in the page that you have in front of you. But that's not what it says in Hilchot Sefer Torah. In Hilchot Sefer Torah, it said, he saw there was a machloket between all the Sfarim, and he decided to write a Sefer Torah, the Sefer shesamachnu alav b'dvarim eilu, hu ha-Sefer hayadua b'Mitzrayim, etc., and so forth. Why she'akol hayu somchim bo, etc. V'alav samachti b'Sefer HaTorah shekatafti. That's what the Rambam says. The Rambam doesn't say that he wrote a first manuscript or tikkun. That in itself is interesting. The Rambam says in Ilchot Sefer Torah that this manuscript of Ben Asher that he used, Sefer Yalid Mitzrayim, Shu Koleh Arba V'Esrim Sfarim, Shehaya B'Yerushalayim Mikama Shanim. What does that mean to you? If you had to, it was in Yerushalayim Mikama Shanim. What's Kama Shanim? Well, Kama Shanim. Shehaya B'Yerushalayim Kama Shanim. What?
It was brought from somewhere else.
No, yes, it was brought from Yerushalayim to Egypt, but he's describing it. This Sefer was in Yerushalayim Mikama Shanim. 1,000 years? Kama Shanim. What does this say? Tanaim v'Amoraim. The Rambam didn't say Tanaim v'Amoraim. If it was Tanaim v'Amoraim, the Rambam would have said so. I'm very happy to say so. The Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam says it was in Yerushalayim, Kama Shanim. I don't know how much Kama is. 50 years, 25 years, 100 years maybe. But not Tanaim v'Amoraim. That's not what Kama Shanim means. By no stretch of the imagination. Why do I cite the Meiri? Meiri was writing between 1300 and 1313 in France. Isn't it amazing? The Rambam traveled all the way from Egypt to France, and he found the Sefer Ezra Kohen HaSofer. And the Meiri, who lives in southern France, he doesn't know anything about it. And now he doesn't know anything about it, nobody in France knows anything about it, and nobody in Ashkenaz knows anything about it, and he has to write a letter to Rameir Halevi, he has to contact the official list that was prepared by Rameir Halevi Avalafia in the 13th century, and Rameir Halevi Avalafia knew nothing about it. He lived shortly, he was a younger contemporary and lived after the Rambam. He knew nothing about it. And he wrote letters everywhere, and he also wrote to Eretz Yisrael, and to Germany, and so on, and to France. Nobody knew about this. Excuse me? Oh yeah, sure he had the Mishneh Torah. So, he does. The Yad Raman, or is it Rameir Halevi, did he use the Mishneh Torah? Of course he used the Mishneh Torah. Well, you're asking why wasn't he satisfied with the Mishneh Torah? He really wasn't satisfied with it. Good question. I'll give you a few answers. One of them I'm going to save because it's going to be the essence of what I'm going to talk about, so I don't want to give it away right away. But it's what the real controversy is today in 1996, so we'll save that for the last part of my comments. But some answers are as follows. Some very important answers. The Rambam in the Mishneh Torah is unclear because he has these lists of the Ptuchot and Stumot. We don't know how to read them. See, what the Rambam did, basically, he would list 13 Parshiot, let's say. And then at the end of the list of 13, he would say, these are Ptuchot. Then he'd list 7, he'd say, these are Stumot. And he'd give the first word of that Parsha. Sometimes that first word occurs 3 times. Now, which of these 3 first words did the Rambam mean was the first word of the Parsha? We don't know. So, as much as the Rambam tried to fix the text for all time, we have several problems. Among the problems are, immediately to answer you, A, it's difficult to establish a good text of the Rambam. As if you would take 2 different printed editions of the Rambam and hold them in front of you, you'd see they don't agree with each other. And certainly if you go beyond the printed editions to the manuscripts of the Rambam himself. So even the lists of the Rambam are somewhat unclear in terms of the text of the Rambam. And second, even if we had a text that we think we can read it, we're not sure we're understanding the text correctly. So for all those reasons, we had to move beyond the Rambam himself. But I have to tell you, halacha l'maaseh, in case you're interested, all Sifrei Torah today are written according to the Rambam. Just according to how we read the Rambam. That is, some people read the Rambam one way, some people read the Rambam one way. But halacha l'maaseh, all Sifrei Torah today in Parshiot, Ptuchot and Stumot, follow the Rambam depending what your understanding of the Rambam is. Each sofer how he understands the Rambam. But we follow the Rambam. The Rambam, this is an agreement already, even though there are many other shitot aside from the Rambam. Rabbeinu Tam has a whole different list of Ptuchot and Stumot for Torah. Different from the Rambam. Rabbeinu Tam has been rejected. The Rambam won this one. Now, B'chol Yisrael, B'chol Tfutzot Yisrael, we follow the Parshiot of the Rambam, but we're not sure what the Rambam said.
You can come out with 2 or 3 different
Yes, you certainly can in the name of the Rambam. Absolutely. And indeed they exist. There are Sifrei Torah in existence right now in different shuls right here in Brooklyn, which have their Parshiot one way or the other way, both according to the Rambam, depending on which Perush on the Rambam we're talking about. Okay. We're beginning to get to the real controversy. You can imagine if there's Sifrei Torah right now, right here, that have different ptuchot and stumot, and the halacha is also that if you don't have the ptuchot stumot correct, your Sefer Torah is pasul. So depending where you decide to daven in the morning, you may be davening in a kosher, in a shul that has a kosher Torah, or one that doesn't have a kosher Torah. It's not a simple matter. And if you really wanted to be medakdek, you'd probably have to spend the whole Shabbat traveling from synagogue to synagogue and listening to many different kriyot HaTorah from different Sifrei Torah until you can be sure that one way or another you probably have what the Rambam said. Yes.
In the Mishkan Torah, the Rambam says, what's his source for this Tumotim?
Each Rambam says, Sefer Ben Asher.
Ben Asher text.
Yes, that's exactly, he says very clearly.
From Yerushalayim.
Absolutely. Well, in his day in Egypt.
He doesn't say why Ben Asher is accepted.
Yes, he did say. He said very clearly, Sha'kol Somchin Alav. It was, Rambam is not, and it's very important, the Rambam is not the one who decided to make this scroll famous. This scroll was famous before the Rambam ever used it. Everybody used it before.
What point did it want to call the Aleppo Codex?
Well, we'll get to that shortly, okay? Yes.
Ben Asher, there was some rumors that was Karaite. How does that fit?
We'll try that too a little later, okay? Let's first say with our text, okay? It's very suspicious that if the Meiri didn't know about this, how could the Rambam know about a text in France that nobody in France knows about? Very, very suspicious. Very suspicious. Now I have to tell you something else. This says that the Rambam visited France. That's also very suspicious. The Rambam visited France. How come nobody in France knew that the Rambam visited France? We have many Gdolim who lived in the time of the Rambam in France, and we have lots of information. Nobody ever says that they met the Rambam in France or anywhere else in Europe before he left Spain. And as a matter of fact, there was a great scholar in southern France, Shmuel Ibn Tibon, who was working on a translation of the Moreh Nevuchim from Arabic into Hebrew, and corresponded with the Rambam and wanted to meet the Rambam, was dying to meet the Rambam, and tells us that he never had the opportunity to meet the Rambam. He wrote a letter to the Rambam telling the Rambam, I am prepared to leave France and I'm about to embark and I want to go and visit you in Fastat, in Old Cairo, in Egypt, so that I can ask you all my questions, those parts, whatever it is I didn't understand, am I translating correctly the text, etc. Anyway, I want to meet you, the Rambam. And the Rambam wrote back a very famous letter, which is in print, a very famous letter of the Rambam to Shmuel Ibn Tibon, saying, don't waste your time. Stay home. Should you make the trip, and should you come to visit me, you won't see me. I have no time. Sorry. To Shmuel Ibn Tibon. And then the Rambam described his daily routine. He said, I am the physician. I get up early in the morning, and I leave for the Sultan Al-Fadl's harem and his palace, and I'm all day, non-stop, all the sick come to me. Comes Ma'ariv time, I think. I don't remember the fine details of the letter, but approximately he's there all day until night, and he comes back at night. He didn't have breakfast yet, didn't have lunch yet, didn't have supper yet. Comes back at night to his house. First of all, he has to daven. Right? He davens Ma'ariv, and then he davens Ma'ariv, and then there's a long line, all the Jews. He just was the doctor for all the royal authorities. Now he has all the Jews waiting online, all the sick Jews in Egypt. So he's lying on his back, he says, and taking his meal. And as he's lying on his back and taking his meal, one patient walks in after another, and he barely gets, he's able to see the patients every night, and he has to send them away, finally, late at night. He says, I don't need any visitors. So don't waste your time. He said, even if you'll come here, he says, you'll be able to stand at a distance and see me, but you won't be able to have any meetings with me. So the Rambam traveled to France. Who are we kidding? So Shmuel Ibn Tibon didn't know that the Rambam traveled to France, even though he wanted the Rambam to come to France, and he couldn't even see the Rambam in Egypt, never mind in France. Yes?
It happened much earlier. The Mishnah Torah is written much earlier in time.
Then what?
The end of his life.
That's right, but not much earlier. The Mishnah Torah was written from 1170 to 1180. Rambam dies in 1204. Yes, the Moreh Nevuchim was written later, so between 1190 and 1200. Okay, what does that have to do? Doesn't change the fact that the Rambam could not be seen. In any event, no Jew in France, there's absolutely no record of anyone knowing that the Rambam had ever been in France. Well, if there's no record that the Rambam had ever been in France, there's no record that a Sefer Ezra was ever seen in France by anybody else in France, the answer is this is all imaginary. This is Lahoyu Dvar Me'olam. This is a tale about the Rambam that was invented, as many tales about the Rambam were invented, but it really can't be taken seriously. The final proof of the pudding, if there are still skeptics here, is a famous tshuva of Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam. The Rambam was succeeded in Egypt as Nagid by his son Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, and we have the Shelotu Tshuvot Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam that I'm holding in my hand. And this is Siman Tzadi Aleph. Siman Tzadi Aleph. And Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam was asked, how do you write Ptuchot and Stumot? And how do we know? How are we supposed to write Ptuchot and Stumot in a Sefer Torah? And he was asked, moreover, what shall we do? It's true that your father in the Mishneh Torah wrote a list of Ptuchot and Stumot, but we examine Sifrei Torah all over Israel, and we see that there are many that vary, that don't have what the Rambam has. If we don't write according to what your father wrote, is the Sefer Torah pasul? That's a question Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam was asked. And Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam answers as follows. בעניין הפתוחות והסתומות הנמצאות בספרי תורות בניגוד למה שפורש בספר אהבה. כבר השבתי מקדם ואנו חוזרים כאן על תמציתו. והוא שאנו רואים שיש הרבה חילוקים בין הסופרים בדבר הפרשיות הפתוחות והסתומות. Rabbi Avraham says, we know there are many different practices. והספרים הנמצאים בישראל שונים הרבה בעניין זה. וכבר ראינו בעלי הוראה זו שנקראו במעמדם בכל אחד מן הספרים הללו, והוא דבר של טעם כי אין לנו ספר האזהרה שנוכל לדקדק ממנו את הדבר. Avraham says, we don't have one official authoritative text that can decide this issue. And specifically, we don't have Sefer HaZarah. Sefer HaZarah is mentioned in Tosefta. It's mentioned elsewhere in rabbinic literature. It is sometimes read Sefer Ezra instead of Sefer HaZarah. Sometimes it's spelled Ayin Zayin Reish Hey. Sometimes it's spelled Ayin Zayin Reish Aleph. And he says specifically, we don't have such a Sefer. We have no such Sefer. We have nothing that we can turn to as authoritative. ואין בעניין זה קבלה שהכל מסכימים עליה עד שנפסל מה שיסתור אותה. So that we can actually say that a certain Sefer Torah is pasul. ונכון לדקדק את הדבר כפי שהוא בחיבור. If you're asking what to do, the answer is follow my father in the Mishneh Torah, and that is the halacha, בספר אהבה. אך מה ששונה ממנו, if you see a Sefer Torah that doesn't follow the חיבור, אין נפסק עליו שהוא פסול, אלא אם יהיה שונה Mikol hasfarim hanimtzaim. So here's the principle, and the principle is simple. Follow my father. However, if you don't follow my father, then if the difference is a difference that occurs in no other Sefer Torah, the Sefer Torah is pasul. If it's a difference that you can find another authority for, it's kasher. So Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam. But what's important here, why do I cite this Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam? What doesn't Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam know about? He doesn't know about his father making a trip to France and finding the Sefer of Ezra Kohen HaGadol. Because if he did, he wouldn't be able to write what he had here. So this passage can't be taken very seriously. It is a legend that was written by someone after the Rambam died. I have no idea who wrote it, when it was written. But, and the Chidah, so now at least I can say the following about the Chidah. I read to you the passage and you heard with the Chidah. But the Chidah then, he found this manuscript, he then concludes his comments by saying the Chidah had great doubts about this. Now, so the Chidah then said, however, it's possible, the Chidah said, it's possible that the Rambam wrote the Mishneh Torah first, based on whatever he wrote about Ben Asher, and he wrote a Sefer Torah, then he traveled to France, you see. So that other manuscript, that's why it's not in the Mishneh Torah. It's a safek in his eyes. So I just want to show you that even the Chidah was aware that he's not entirely sure this is correct. However, I have to tell you, even if it happened that way, the Rambam should have corrected the Chibur. We know that the Rambam kept correcting the Chibur until the day he died. So if he now really corrected the Chibur, his Sefer Torah according to Sefer Ezra Kohen, he would have put that in the Mishneh Torah, believe me. Moreover, as you already saw from Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, right, that Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam knows nothing about this. So there isn't what to talk about. Lo hayu dvarim me'olam.
So why bring it up? Why you
you'll see in a minute. Good. Now, briefly, I take it everyone in this room knows well some more detail than I will give of what I'm going to describe for you, and that is that in Aleppo, Syria, there was a very famous manuscript containing all 24 books of Tanakh. And as a matter of fact, in Aleppo, Syria, they believe that this was written by Ezra HaKohen. That was the tradition in Aleppo. This manuscript was very carefully guarded and preserved by the Aleppo community until 1947. In 1947, when the United Nations announced the partition, that there would be two states created in what was Palestine. One of them would be the state of Israel. The partition, that there would be two states created in what was Palestine. One of them would be the state of Israel. Riots broke out in Aleppo and elsewhere. And during those riots, synagogue was burned, the main synagogue where various scrolls were kept, including the Aleppo Codex. Many of these scrolls were destroyed. Some were preserved. The Aleppo Codex was damaged in 1947. At that time, there were all sorts of rumors. Some said it was totally destroyed. Others say it wasn't totally destroyed. Rumors were circulating for many years. But in fact, the scroll was preserved. And we have many different versions from Jews in Aleppo as to how it was preserved and who preserved it and so on, but it was preserved. And that particular scroll in 1958 was presented to President Ben Tzvi in Jerusalem. It was smuggled out of Aleppo, Syria by a Jew named Mordechai Pacham, and he delivered it safely into the hands of President Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. It was then given over to the Machon Ben Tzvi. It was for a while in the Israel Museum, it was a while in the Hebrew University. They had to find the right place to preserve it and so on. It has since been photographed in beautiful color photographs and is available now in a beautiful color reproduction for anybody who wants to acquire the Aleppo Codex in a color reproduction. The question is...
Excuse me, is it illuminated?
There were parts that were said to have been illuminated, but if they were, they're lost. That is by the way, the Aleppo Codex, which once had 24 books, we only have about 2/3 of it. 1/3 is gone. The 1/3 that's gone is the beginning and the end, because we're missing virtually the entire Torah, and we're missing many books at the end, most 4 out of 5 Megillot, and so on, and other parts of it. Some stray pages from the middle parts, that is from the Nevi'im, are also missing. But about 2/3 is preserved. Now the question is this the scroll that the Rambam saw? It's a crucial question. Is this the scroll that the Rambam copied from? If the Rambam said he had a copy of the scroll that was in Egypt, what did the Rambam tell us? It was in Yerushalayim for Kama Shanim. Then from Yerushalayim was brought to Egypt. The Rambam doesn't say anything about it being anywhere except in Egypt, of course. It was in Egypt. Next we hear of it is the Aleppo Codex, which has since been published. Now all major Tanakhs, new Tanakhs that are based upon the Aleppo Codex. So if you buy yourself what's known as the Breuer Tanakh, the Mosar Rav Kook Tanakh, the Mosar Rav Kook Tanakh is in fact a copy of the Aleppo Codex to the extent that can be done. That is, as I said, we only have 2/3 of Tanakh, more or less preserved in the Aleppo Codex. Now we have good testimony about the history of this scroll. I mean by that as follows. Ben Asher lived in Tveria. And the Ben Asher family was a very famous family in school, father and son for many generations that wrote Sifrei Torah. Or wrote not only Sifrei Torah, but wrote Masoretic manuscripts of all of Tanakh. That is, these are non-kosher books. These are books that can't be read from publicly during the service. But they have the complete text of Tanakh carefully preserved with the Masoretic notes that belong to that text. So this was done by a whole series of Ben Asherite members, the most famous being Moshe Ben Asher and his son Aaron Ben Asher. Those are the two most famous, but there were other members of this family. The Rambam's Codex, the Codex that presumably the Rambam copied from, was written by Aaron ben Asher. And just to give you the kind of evidence that allows us to say that with some confidence, I have a Xerox copy of a little booklet that I would love to own, but I can't. It's by this time a rare book. This is Keter Aram Sovar. The Aleppo Codex, of course, was known as the Keter, the Taj, the Keter, and this little booklet was published in Aleppo. This is a description of that codex, which is now in Yerushalayim, a description of that codex published in Aleppo by M. Nechmad, and was published in Tafresh Tzadi Gimel. It was published before World War II, Tafresh Tzadi Gimel, 1933. So here I have a vivid description of the codex when it was full, when it was not the two-thirds that we have today, but the entire text. And this publishes the text of the front pages, the text of the back pages, and describes some other scrolls. It was one of 4 such scrolls that once were in Aleppo. The other scrolls were illuminated. You asked about illumination. This one in particular was not illuminated. But it did have some front pages and some back pages with inscriptions, and the inscription which is gone now. Remember, the front pages and back pages are gone. But that entire inscription is printed here in this little booklet from Aleppo in 1933, and it says that this codex was vocalized. The Misorah, the Nikud, were written by Aaron ben Asher, and he was Magiah it again and again, and he kept correcting it, and he corrected the Ptuchot and Stumot, so that anybody who wanted to know how to write the Ptuchot and Stumot would read this text. That's what it said in those pages that are now gone. But here I have testimony from 1933 that those pages were once part of the Aleppo Codex. We're just giving you the kind of evidence, and I'm going to tell you a little more about more important kinds of evidence that we now have, that indeed indicate absolutely the scroll that's now in Yerushalayim was the scroll that was in Aleppo. It was the Aleppo Codex, and the Aleppo Codex was the codex that the Rambam used when he wrote his description of which parshiot are the Ptuchot and which are the Stumot and so on. In the 14th century, and in the 15th century, the descendants of the Rambam had a son, famous about Rambam and Rambam, and Avram had children, and they had children, and they were all the leaders of the Egyptian Jewish community for many years. In the 14th century, the Maimonides family in Egypt left Egypt and moved to Aleppo. We have lots of records of that. We know their names. We know when they moved to Aleppo. And when they came to Aleppo, they not only came, with their households, they brought their library with them. And they described some of the items they brought with them, and they brought with them the original copies of the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam. They were brought to Aleppo. And we have lots of records of these. The Radvaz and some great authorities later said whenever they had a question in the text of the Rambam, they would go to Aleppo and consult the text of the Rambam in Aleppo. I'm talking now about the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam to make sure that they had the correct text. So we know that the Rambam's family left Egypt and came to Aleppo, as did many other Jews. Therefore, it is not surprising, although we have no detail of this, no one ever says this, it is not surprising that that text that had once been prepared by a family in Tiberia, and from Tiberia it was sold to a Jewish community in Jerusalem, and it was sold to a Karaite community. You asked about the Karaites? It was sold, as was very commonplace. Great manuscripts of Tanakh were sold to Karaite synagogues. It was sold to a Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem. And the evidence for that is presented very nicely, by the way, in this book by Nechmat. So for a while, it was in the hands of the Karaites in Jerusalem. Sure. Taken captive. We have the evidence. Taken from Jerusalem. To a rabbinate synagogue. Not a Karaite synagogue, a rabbinate. Resided in the Rambam. So all that is pretty much documented. No problem with that. We have no documentation of exactly who brought it or when it was brought from Egypt to Aleppo. But what we do have is a great Gadol in the 15th century, Rabbi Sadia Adeni, who wrote a Perush and Sefer Hava in the 15th century, and he writes in his Perush and Sefer Hava that when he wasn't sure about something the Rambam wrote in Sefer Hava, he went to Aleppo And he saw there the Aleppo Codex, he saw the Keter, he identifies it as the Jews, and he says the Jews of Aleppo call it the Keter, and he examined that very manuscript that the Rambam used when the Rambam wrote Hilchot Sefer Torah and wrote his Sefer Torah, listing the Parshiot, Ptuchot and Stumot. So we have evidence from the 15th century, an eyewitness who's in Aleppo, and he says that the very scroll that the Rambam used in Egypt is now in Aleppo. And from the 15th century on, in every century, there is a tshuva, and I don't want to take the time now to cite them, but famous tshuvot from the 16th century, the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Tshuvot where rabbis were asked, how do you spell a certain word in the Torah, or is this a patuach or a satum? And the letter was sent to Aleppo, and the rabbi in Aleppo says, I went and I examined the Keter, and the Keter is written such and such, and therefore that's how you should do it. So from every century, from the 15th century on, the Aleppo Codex is in Aleppo, and everybody in the world knows that the Aleppo Codex is in Aleppo. So there's no question about this.
What about the Sefer that Rambam actually wrote?
Lost. Rambam Sefer Torah? No one knows where it is. Gone. Okay. Yes.
But Ben Asher himself, was he a Karaite?
Well, very briefly, okay? Let me point out the modern controversy, and then I'll talk about this very briefly, the issue of whether he was a Karaite. There's no reason to believe he was a Karaite. As I say, the Keter was for a short while in the hands of Karaites. And some of those inscriptions on the front pages and the last pages of the Keter, which are preserved by Nechmad, are clearly the inscriptions of that community in Yerushalayim. When it was in Jerusalem, it was in Karaite hands, and they listed some Karaite rules and regulations as to how the Keter should be used. Karaites read from what's known as a mitzchaf. Karaites, and in fact, in Karaite halacha, in pure Karaite halacha, that is, in Karaite halacha of the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, before Karaites were contaminated by rabbis, in pure Karaite halacha, you're only allowed to read Shabbat from a vocalized text of Tanakh. In other words, this is what you read from on Shabbat. You don't read from, doesn't necessarily have to be on cloth, but it's better to be on cloth, that is, it could be on parchment, but even if it's on parchment in page form, in codex form. Karaites only read from the codex. You don't read from the Sefer Torah. And it must have the Nikud and the Ta'amim. And if it doesn't have Nikud and Ta'amim, you can't read from it. So the Karaites, when they had this scroll, for them it was a Sefer Torah, it was a Sefer Tanakh. It was all the Kedusha of a Sefer Tanakh. And it could be read on Shabbat and festivals and so on. And they, in fact, it had so much Kedusha that it was only read on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. That is, it was preserved for the greatest festivals and for the biggest crowds. Otherwise, it wasn't pulled out. That's when it was in Karaite hands. When it was in Rabbinite hands, as indeed it was, you're not allowed to read from this scroll. It was used only as a model which you could look at, make notes, copy those notes, and then prepare a kosher Sefer Torah on the basis of the Aleppo Codex.
What is the Rambam found it necessary to make another code if the codex existed in this time?
Why did he?
He didn't write another manual on how to access the Torah.
He didn't, like, who said he wrote another manual? That was only from that page in front of you. Nowhere in the writings of the Rambam does it say that he didn't have to write another manual, and he didn't. He wrote a Sefer Torah. There's a mitzvah aseh for every Jew to write a Sefer Torah. He wrote a Sefer Torah. That's all. All right? Not a manual, a Sefer Torah. When all the Rambam says is that he used the Aleppo Codex as his guide in terms of how to write the Sefer Torah properly. All right. Now, remember we said that the Aleppo Codex that we now have in Yerushalayim is missing the Torah. Doesn't have the Torah. But it does have Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Most of Nevi'im and Ketuvim. On the other hand, the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah, where he wrote the rules of Ptuchot and Stumot, what did he write the rules for? Only for Sefer Torah. Only for Sefer Torah. He listed all the Ptuchot and Stumot for Sefer Torah. So, there are some difficulties. First, in being sure that the Aleppo Codex is the codex that the Rambam used. The best way to prove it would be to examine the Ptuchot and Stumot. But we're missing just that part that the Rambam copied from. Solution to that is very simple. I just told you that in every generation rabbis had problems in different communities in the world, and they would send letters to Aleppo. And Aleppo would say, in the Aleppo Codex it says such and such. And therefore, and those letters are in all the famous lists of Shailot and Shuvot. So all those Shailot and Shuvot have been gathered together for every century. All these are from Torah, right? And every answer that came from Aleppo with regard to the Aleppo Codex, where was a Ptucha and Stuma, and they asked about Ptuchot and Stumot, it's exactly what the Rambam has in Hilchot Sefer Torah, first. Second, many of the questions had to do about spelling, Chaser, Vayeter. People had questions about it. Do you spell a word with a Vav, without a Vav, with a Yud, without a Yud? And we have all the answers from the Aleppo Codex. And those answers were for all of Tanakh. And we have 2/3 of the Aleppo Codex. Every question that was asked of the Aleppo Codex and every answer that came, where we have the Aleppo Codex that we can examine it today, that's exactly what it says in the Tshuva we saw in the Aleppo Codex. That's what we have in our Aleppo Codex. And the proof that we have the right scroll, and this ends all discussion, we don't have to go further, is that in many instances it is uniqueness. What do I mean by uniqueness? I'll give you a sample. The Rambam in Hilchot Sefer Torah writes that the Shirah in Parshat Ha'azinu has 67 lines. And the Rambam gives us the first word of every one of the 67 lines, and those lines are divided in half, so he gives us the first word of each hemistic, each half of the Shirah and Ha'azinu. That's what the Rambam says. In Hilchot Sefer Torah, there are 67 lines. And the Rambam said, I wrote all the Shirot, according to the Aleppo Codex. And if there are breaks in lines, that has to do with Parshiyot, breaks in lines in the middle, Rambam gives us the first word of all 67 lines, and all the breaks. That part of the Aleppo Codex is here. We have Parshat Ha'azinu. You know how many lines there are in the Shirah of Parshat Ha'azinu in every Sefer Torah in Brooklyn? 70 lines. But in the Aleppo Codex there are 67 lines. And only in the Aleppo Codex, in no other Hebrew manuscript in antiquity are there 67 lines in Parshat Ha'azinu. The Rambam says there are 67 lines. The Aleppo Codex right now in 1996 has 67 lines. It can be examined in Yerushalayim. And no other Ben Asher manuscript even has 67 lines. No other manuscript in the family has 67 lines. That's uniqueness, and there are other examples of uniqueness, which means the Rambam used the Aleppo Codex, and we have that codex, the very codex that he used. Now, I'm sorry, you wanted to...
Well, just you said before that everyone follows the Rambam in some fashion or another.
Right.
Okay, so how come we all have 71? I mean, that's not something you could, miss.
Good question. Can't get away with anything over here. Although the Rambam wrote 67 lines, in the Rambam's day, there are many different Sifrei Torah that circulated. There are many other Shitot in the Rishonim, and they wrote 70 lines. Most of those Shitot wrote 70 lines. The Rambam was unique in adopting the 67 lines, which he adopted from the unique codex, from the best single copy of Tanakh in existence. Right? There were two problems. One is many people had a minhag of writing 70, and there are good sources for 70 lines, by the way, early, even rabbinic sources for writing 70 lines. And two, no one could figure out how to write the 67 lines that the Rambam wrote. That is, a sofer has to weigh all sorts of things. How many lines in a column, the width of the column, there are many halachot. If you follow all the halachot of Sefer Torah and writing a Sefer Torah the way you should write a Sefer Torah, no sofer knew how to write this shirah in 67 lines, and it should remain a kosher Sefer Torah. It was a mystery, all right? It was very hard to do. So on the one hand, we had many Sefer Torah that anyway had 70 lines, and for good reason, because to write it in 67 lines meant redividing the words in such a way that you couldn't get the first word that the Rambam wanted to each half of the line in 67 lines. It just didn't work. And remember, you have to figure out the size of the letters, the size of the lines, the space between the top of the column and the bottom of the column. All these are regulated by halakha. If you try to apply all the halachot the Rambam told you to write in Hilchot Sefer Torah, you couldn't write a Sefer Torah in 67 lines unless you had the Rambam Sefer Torah in front of you. That's lost. We don't have it. We didn't know how he did it. Or the Codex. we have the Codex now. We know exactly how he did it. In fact, there are many Rishonim and Achronim who wrote long Pulim as to what the Rambam must have meant, as how you write it in 67 lines, and 9/10 of these Pulim disappear in the light of now that we can look at the Aleppo Codex and see what the real answer is. Anyway,
today based on it?
no, now we're getting to the modern controversy, okay. Anyway, what happened was, and you go home and check your Rambam, what happened was, is this was so impossible, and it rendered every Sefer Torah pasul. If the Rambam, you don't write it the way the Rambam writes it, your Sefer Torah is pasul. That's halakha in the Shulchan Aruch. That is, it's not dependent on the Rambam. The Torah and the Shulchan Aruch agree that that's the case. If Rambam says 67 lines, so in our printed Rambams, it doesn't say that the Shira has 67 lines. You go just check your Rambam when you go home. Hilchot Sefer Avah, Hilchot Sefer Torah. How many lines you should have in the Shira? It says 70 lines. They changed the text of the Rambam from 67 to 70 because no one could figure out what the 67 was. So that our present printed, the standard edition, all the yeshivot, says 70 lines. However, God bless Aleppo. Remember I told you Aleppo had the Rambam's own copy of Mishneh Torah. And Aleppo also had copies of the Mishneh Torah, not his own copy doesn't exist anymore, but a copy of Sefer Mada and Sefer Hava with the Rambam's autograph, where the Rambam says, Muga al pi ktav yadi. Rambam, and then he signed Moshe Rebbe Maimon. Rambam signed a copy, which was in Aleppo, a copy of of his Sefer Hava, Hilchot Sefer Torah, and he said, he himself testified, this was copied correctly, from my original manuscript. We have his autograph on that manuscript. That manuscript is now at Oxford University in the Bodleian Library. Anybody here can go look at it.
But they have to know it's the Rambam's signature.
Yes, okay, but it's there. We have lots of letters of the Rambam from the Cairo Geniza, no question. This is the Rambam's autograph. I saw it with my own eyes. And I can tell you that it's about to be re-photographed so that everybody can own it and have it in their house. And it has all the nuschaot exactly as they are in the Aleppo Codex today, and it says for the Shira, 67 lines. That's the real text of the Rambam, the original text of the Rambam, and those 67 lines are the 67 lines that we have in the Aleppo Codex as well. Did you mean something else, or did you mean to imply that it's forged, or?
No, Rabbi Bassoon had written.
Oh yes, the Rambam had their different handwritings and so on, but his autograph is clear as daylight. We have lots of copies of his autograph from letters from the Cairo Geniza, and that's the autograph. As I saw it the morning, on this text that was in Aleppo, was bought by a traveler who was in Aleppo and brought to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Now, listen carefully. And I kept you long enough, I won't keep you much longer. Nevi'im and Ktuvim also have Parshiyot. And for Ktuvim it is particularly important. Why? I don't know what all your minhagim are or aren't, but certainly every Jew reads Megillat Esther on Purim. And we read 5 Megillot, many of us, at various festivals and so on. We read Shir HaShirim publicly in Eicha and so on. Now, it's been the practice in probably the last 500 years or so in many communities from the advent of printing to read Haftorot from a printed Tanakh or a printed Navi, and to read Eicha or Kohelet, for those who read Kohelet publicly, or Shir HaShirim and so on, to read from a Tanakh. Baal Koreh gets up in the middle of the shul, pulls out a Chumash with the Megillot in the back, and starts reading the Megillah. This has been the practice in the last 500 years. It wasn't the practice before printing was invented. And it's certainly not what halacha requires. And already the earliest halachists who saw this practice protested against it, but to no avail. To no avail because there was a tremendous expense involved. You read Haftarot from various books of Nevi'im. If you're going to follow the real halacha, which is that you should read from a cloth, just as you read a Sefer Torah, if you can read from parchment without nikud and without tamim, you've got to hire a sofer to write all these scrolls. You're going to need a Yishayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, and so on. And then you're going to limit the kibudim that you can give in your synagogue, because you can then only call somebody up to read from it who knows how to read from a Navi without vocalization, which is no small matter. So I don't know what the practice is in right here. Does anybody know here, right in this Beit Knesset? You read from a book.
Beit Knesset, we have a Sefer Haftarot just on the parchment, just of each Haftarah.
And someone, and it's
but not the whole. No,
oh, just of each Haftarah, I understand. But is it used? I mean, it's just...
By people that can read well.
But people that can read well, it's used. Okay. That's less expensive, obviously. In other words, the higher is sofer just to write out haftarot. Okay. Well, if you do this as it was done by the Rishonim, as it was done in the time of the Rambam, they had all the books of Nevi'im and Ketuvim written on cloth.
Like at the courtail.
Excuse me?
At the courtail they have.
At the Kotel, fine. And in many synagogues, it's a growing practice now. Even in Brooklyn, it's a growing practice. Actually, the Gaon of Vilna in Sefer Masirav, the Gaon of Vilna instituted in his minyan that they only read from cloth, and he had it prepared and was prepared to spend the money and so on, and it was no great problem for him to read Tanakh, so he could read it if no one else could, presumably. In any event, Chaim Blum does it today. It goes back to the Gaon. It was reinstituted by the Gaon of Vilna primarily. Well, if you're going to write Nevi'im and Ketuvim and do it properly, then what do you need for Nevi'im and Ketuvim? What's the next thing that you need? What does the sofer need immediately? What does he need to know? He has to know where the Ptuchot and Stumot are. You can't write it. We don't. All our printed editions are totally nothing. They don't follow any tradition. Ptuchot and Stumot. I need Ptuchot and Stumot for Nevi'im and Ketuvim. And where you particularly need it is for Megillat Esther, because Megillat Esther everybody reads from the cloth. And you have to have the Ptuchot and Stumot proper, and if they're not done properly, your Megillah is not a Megillah Kshera. A very difficult matter. This was a matter that has nothing, was separate from the Aleppo Codex. It was a matter that bothered all the Rishonim. How do you write a Megillat Esther? And a regel achat, what I'll simply tell you is that all Megillot now are written according to a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, Hilchot Megillah, where the Ramah, nine spaces in the next word. That's what's meant by a stuma, and there are only stumot in Megillat Esther. But the Ramah writes that based on a compromise that is already in the time of the Ramah. Nobody remembered where the Ptuchot are, where the stumot were, and we have a general halacha in Sefer Torah and in all writing of scrolls, and that is, if you have a doubt, holchin achaharov, we follow the majority. That's how all Sifrei Torah are written today. By the way, our Sifrei Torah in our synagogues right now are not the same as the Aleppo Codex. And make no mistake about it. There are words in the Aleppo Codex that are spelled differently. It's close, but not the same. So how do we read our Sifrei Torah? The answer is there were doubts through the ages. People didn't have easy access to the Aleppo Codex, and so they collated. That's what Meiri did. That's what Reb Meir Halevi Abulafia did. That's what Reb Menachem Limzano did at a later period, Minchat Shai at a later period, and finally a great rabbi in Hungary, Reb Shlomo Gansfried, collated all the various shitot. He had the Meiri in front of him, and he had the Minchat Shai in front of him, and he had all the different authorities and the Masoretic notes, and he counted. In every case, he simply counted, and he said the majority reads this way. That's how we're going to write a Sefer Torah, and all Sifrei Torah basically today are written the same way, based on a Sefer called Keset HaSofer. The Chatam Sofer wrote Haskama to it, and the Chatam Sofer wrote, from now on, every Sefer is to be written according to Keset HaSofer. And all our Megillot are written according to Keset HaSofer, so that all Megillot Esther today have only Parshiot Stumot. But we have the Aleppo Codex. We now have the Aleppo Codex. Beautiful color photographs. Everybody can look at it. And if you want to see the original, it's in Yerushalayim. And you can see it. And in the Aleppo Codex, I have to be careful. Okay. Thank God. Okay. Good man. I told you that we're missing a third of the Aleppo Codex. We're missing the beginning and the end. And of the end part of the Aleppo Codex, what are we missing? We're missing most of the Megillot, part of Shir Hashirim and all the rest of the Megillot. So we don't have Megillot Esther of the Aleppo Codex. Well, what do we have? Excuse me? That's not the Aleppo Codex. No. It's from the Ben Asher family, but very different from the Aleppo Codex, and especially with regard to the Parshiot. No, we don't use Leningrad. You have it in front of you? Oh, wonderful. Okay. What do you mean? You have a copy of Leningrad 19? Yeah, I own a copy too. Wonderful, but that's not the Aleppo Codex. Don't confuse it with the Aleppo Codex. Okay, and then it was not authorized by the Rambam or anybody else as the official text. The official text indeed is the Aleppo Codex, and that is not. You went to France, not to Leningrad. That's right. Right. Anyway, it is a Ben Asher manuscript, and it comes from the family. It is an important manuscript. It is not that manuscript that the Rambam says everyone used to correct according to this man. Everyone was Somech on that. They weren't Somech on Leningrad 19A. They were Somech on the Aleppo Codex. Okay. But I'm going to take another minute. I told you that we have, for example, these tshuvot that are written in every century. So we have evidence for those parts, in part, that are lost. They don't help us here. But now I have to tell you something that's amazing, and now this is part of the controversy. There were Jews, very learned Jews, in the previous century even, who knew about the Aleppo Codex. I'm talking about, obviously, in Aleppo, everybody knew about the Aleppo Codex. But what if you were living in Moscow? What if you were living in Vilna? Somewhere in Germany, somewhere far away from Aleppo, and it wasn't easy to travel, and it was very difficult to get information, by the way. Even when you sent letters to Aleppo, they were very careful in Aleppo to watch this manuscript. They didn't allow anyone to photograph the entire manuscript. There were a few stray pages that Christians were allowed to photograph, thank God, because those stray passages that those Christians photographed, and I have copies of them here with me, pages that are now missing from the Aleppo Codex. So
why were the authorities in Aleppo so reluctant to have photocopies made of this?
Very reluctant. For whatever reason, the Kedusha of the Sefer, that it shouldn't be, they were very reluctant at all to open it up. It was kept in a metal safe box. It was kept under lock and key. By the way, when on those rare occasions when famous Rabbanim came to look at it, to check on something, and we have records of these in every century, 2 Gabbayim were appointed in Aleppo, sat on the right and the left of the person who looked at it to make sure they didn't touch the manuscript, they didn't take the manuscript, they didn't do anything you shouldn't do, and so on. They were very careful in Aleppo about this manuscript, and that's why it still exists. But they were so careful they didn't allow anybody to photograph it, which unfortunately is not so wonderful. But
why don't they just let appoint the cipher to make a copy of it?
No, didn't happen. Well, something close to that. Something close to that. I'm glad you raised it with something close to that. Now, there was a Jew. Listen to this amazing story. And very briefly, we'll close with this and with the great problem it now creates for everybody in this room and everywhere else. There was a Jew who lived in Lithuania in the 19th century. His name was Reb Shalom Shachner Yellen, famous Yellen family. He was the father of a commentary that's printed in every edition of the Vilna Shas, Reb Aryeh Leib Yellen's Yefei Einayim, a beautiful commentary printed in the back of the Masechtot of the Vilna Shas. His father was Reb Shalom Shachner Yellen, was born around 1790, died about 1860. He devoted his whole life to Tanakh. He was a sofer, he wrote Sifrei Torah, he corrected Sifrei Torah, he was an itinerant preacher, as it were. He went from community to community, and every community he went to, the first thing he did was he examined the Sefer Torah, and he would correct the Sifrei Torah. He was a master, an expert in spelling, chaser, yeter, ptuchot, stumot. He devoted his entire life just to this issue. I, in particular, was very concerned about ptuchot and stumot for Nevi'im and Tuvim. And he knew about the Aleppo Codex. How could he not know about it? He was a master and expert in this. This is Lithuania, 1840. He was sick, but he decided to go on Aliyah, and he went to Yerushalayim. And the purpose of going on Aliyah was for one purpose only. It was to go from Yerushalayim to Aleppo and see the Aleppo Codex and to publish the Aleppo Codex. That's exactly what he was going to do. For once and for all, not to publish word for word everything, but to list all the ptuchot, the stumot, chaserot, yiterot, everything that wherever there was a problem in world history, there ever was a problem about spelling, about nikud, anything, to make an official list, publish it, and the whole world will know once and for all what's authoritative. And this man came to Yerushalayim, took ill, wrote letters to Aleppo. We have the exchange between the rabbis in Aleppo and this Rabbi Yellen, and a beautiful letter, which is a long letter, and I'm going to read only 2 lines from the long letter. It's a letter by all the rabbis of Yerushalayim in 1850, a letter of introduction given to Rabbi Yellen and sent to Aleppo so that when he comes to Aleppo, he should be treated properly and they should realize who he is. And in this letter it says in part, letter signed by all the rabbis of Yerushalayim. I'm going to read to you some of their names. You'll be astounded to hear who these rabbis were. Okay? מעתה חוב גמור, מוטל עלינו לטרוח בגופנו, במודנו, בכל מה דאפשר להעתיק מהספר הנ"ל. The rabbis of Yerushalayim say, given there's all this debate about what's the correct text of Tanakh, and where are the ptuchot, and where are the stumot, it is obligatory, chov gamur, we have to go to Aleppo, and we must copy from the Aleppo Codex, and once and for all establish what Tanakh should look like. לטרוח בגופנו ובמודנו בכל מה דאפשר להעתיק מהספר הנ"ל כל פתוחות וסתומות. כדי לזכות בספר כשר, so that we will once and for all have a ספר כשר, גם לרבות כל שאר בני הגולה. We're doing this not just for us, we're doing this for every Jew everywhere. וזכותם בספרים כשרים, ולא נהיה מעתה מבוכים. That's part of the letter. And here are the signatures. We actually have the letter, the original letter, with the signatures of the Rabbanim. And I'm just going to read you some of the Rabbanim on the letter. Chaim Nisim Abulafia Sfardi Tahor. Hatzair Rafael Yedidi Abulafia Sfardi Tahor. Noam Yosef Zundel Salant. Rabbi Yosef Zundel Salant, the teacher of Yisrael Salanter, the Talmud Muvhak of Reb Chaim Volozhin, was one of the rabbis in Jerusalem. He signed on this. Shmuel Salant, chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community. Yaakov Berlin, the father of the Netziv. All of them agreed and signed that we have to go to Aleppo and copy this Aleppo Codex, and they said this is halacha l'maaseh. That's why I stressed this line. This wasn't a scientific investigation that historians should know what the Aleppo Codex reads. This was done kedei lizakot b'sefer kasher. We should have once and for all a kosher sefer Torah and a kosher Tanakh. Poor Rabbi Yellen died. He never made it to Aleppo. But before he died, he his whole life prepared a Tanakh. He had a printed Tanakh, and in the margins of that Tanakh, he wrote down every shita and every eyewitness account of anybody who had ever been to Aleppo. He met people who had gone to Aleppo. And he wrote down, so-and-so was in Aleppo, and he checked the codex, and he saw this reading. Every one of those readings, for all of Tanakh, is in a printed edition of Tanakh, a little Tanakh that this Rav Shalom Shechner Yellen saved until the day he died. But before he died, he had a son-in-law. His son-in-law's name was Rav Moshe Yoshua Kimchi, if they ever ask you on a quiz program. He had a son-in-law. And he sent his son-in-law to Aleppo with all these letters. And the son-in-law sat with the Rabbanim of Aleppo, and we have a list of all their names, and they showed him the Aleppo Codex. And he copied out into this little chumash of Rabbi Shalom Shachni Yellen every ptucha, every stuma, every chaser, every yeter, and every problem that he could, patach kamatzer, wherever there was a debate, and he marked it, and he said, Chaf Yud Chet, Ktav Yad Chalet, and he wrote what the Aleppo Codex said. His son-in-law sat there, came back to Eretz Yisrael, and that chumash was never heard from again. However, in 1986, a man by the name of Yellen, who lived in Kiryat Moshe in Jerusalem, whose house was about to cave in, and it was going to be destroyed so they could build some new home there, or apartment, went up into his attic, and he saw that there were old Hebrew books there. He no longer was a Talmid Chacham, had no interest in these Hebrew books, but he knew other Jews in Kiryat Moshe would be interested, and he called a man by the name of the famous politician Shlomo Lorenz in 1986, and he told him, I have these old books, they look like nothing, a Siddur, a Chumash. I'm going to throw them out, and they're destroying this, they're demolishing this old house that the family Yellen always lived in. Maybe you want them, or maybe you'll take them to a dealer, a used book dealer, and sell them. And sure enough, so he picked out whatever he wanted from the library, and he saw the Chumash. He had no interest in this Chumash. It was an old Amsterdam print. And he took it to a used book dealer, and we got what he hoped it would sell for 5 or 10 shekels, etc. Anyway, this last descendant of the Yellen family had a friend in Beit Vegan, in Kiryat Moshe at the time, a man by the name of Yosef Ofer, a young man, a great Masoretic scholar, Yosef Ofer. And he was mentioned to Ofer, you know that the Yellens are having the house demolished. There were some of these old Chumashim. And he remembered, something rang a bell. He remembered Rav Shalom Shachni Yellen. Everybody's been looking for 100 years for this Chumash. This Chumash, that we have all these records that they went and everything was marked in the Chumash. Where is this Chumash? And they found out that Lawrence went to a used bookshop and put it up for sale. He ran there and he found the Chumash, and it was the Chumash of Rav Shalom Shachni Yellen, his name in it, his autograph in it, and every note in it in the handwriting of Shalom Shachniyalim, except for those by his son-in-law, or in his son-in-law's handwriting, who was in Aleppo and copied down everything he saw in Aleppo. So now we have the Masoretic notes, the readings, the Ptuchot and Stumot of all the passages that are missing from the Aleppo Codex. Many of these were published in a volume that I brought with me in 1992. And we have a list here of the Parshiot from the Nevi'im and Ktuvim, according to the Chumash of Shalom Shachniyalim. Here's a photograph of one of the pages of that Chumash. You can come up later and look at it if you want. And then this Ofer, this great Masoretic scholar, printed the complete list of all the Parshiot that are missing now from the Aleppo Codex, based on the evidence of Shalom Shachniyalim. And if you open up to Megillat Esther, which is, of course, what interests me immediately, there are 6 Parshiot Ptuchot in Megillat Esther. And now you understand the tremendous problem we have. We have the Aleppo Codex. There is no question the Aleppo Codex is the codex that the Rambam had. And the Rambam decided for all generations what a Sefer Torah will look like, and we write the Parshiot Ptuchot and Stumot according to the Rambam because he followed the Ben Asher Codex. But the Rambam didn't include the Nevi'im Ktuvim. It wasn't his interest. There's only a halacha min ha-Torah to write a Sefer Torah. He didn't have to worry about the rest of Nach. So that's not in the Rambam. But we have the Aleppo Codex. Now we know for all of Nevi'im what the Ptuchot and Stumot are. And not only that, even for those parts of Ktuvim that are missing, we know what the Ptuchot and Stumot look like. We have the Aleppo Codex. And we have that letter signed by all the Gdolim, Sfaradim, and Ashkenazim together, all in agreement, that we have to go to Aleppo, find out what the Ptuchot and Stumot are, so that we can all write all of Tanakh properly. We have it. We know the answer. There isn't a Sefer Torah, and there isn't a Megillah in Brooklyn that follows the Aleppo Codex. On the one hand, we have our received traditions, Holchen Achar Harov, and that's how our Sfarim are written today. And on the other hand, we have the Aleppo Codex. We know what a Megillah should look like today, and we could follow the Aleppo Codex. So, in Bnei Brak, a whole group of very pious Jews got together, and they have now produced all of Tanakh on cloth, according to the Aleppo Codex. And in Yerushalayim, and our great Frank Rother wrote this way, and don't confuse us with the facts. We're not interested in the Aleppo Codex. And these two groups are engaged in an incredible war, in a battle. Pamphlets published every week. Big broadsides all over Yerushalayim. In Bnei Brak, they say that all the Sfarim coming out of Yerushalayim are pasul. And in Yerushalayim, they say all the Sfarim that are coming out of Bnei Brak are pasul. And all the rabbis are involved. And there are big Kutus Dat Torah, all about this issue. Everything that I discussed tonight, this whole issue. And a major part of the debate is whether that story about the Rambam's going to France and copying from Sefer of Ezra is true or not. And that's also all part of this debate between these two schools. And our great Frank Rother wrote this way, and don't confuse us with the facts. We're not interested in the Aleppo Codex. And these two groups are engaged in an incredible war, in a battle. Pamphlets published every week. Big broadsides all over Yerushalayim. In Bnei Brak, they say that all the Sfarim coming out of Yerushalayim are pasul. And in Yerushalayim, they say all the Sfarim that are coming out of Bnei Brak are pasul. And all the rabbis are involved. And there are big Kutus Dat Torah, all about this issue. Everything that I discussed tonight, this whole issue. And a major part of the debate is whether that story about the Rambam's going to France and copying from Sefer of Ezra is true or not. Unfortunately, in 1996, it's very hard to get all rabbis in one room, and much harder to get all the rabbis to agree. And that's the problem in this great controversy, and that is the new Aleppo Codex controversy. Not whether Ben Asher was a Karaite, not whether we have the Ben Asher Codex, we don't have the Ben Asher Codex, but this whole new controversy of what do you do when the received halacha does not agree with new evidence. You want to call it new archaeological evidence. For the first time, the Aleppo Codex is available for everybody in the world to see. And we have other kinds of evidence, these eyewitness testimony, like the Chumash of Shalom Shachniyalim. How do you weigh tradition against this new kind of evidence, and how do you decide halakha?